Okay, so in this assignment, we need to select a poster to plan for, but we're not going to make the poster just yet. So what are we going to do? Well, as you may have noticed, there are a lot of handouts this week. This is actually a two-sided page for the handout. And on top of that, there's the supplement. So it's one of our longest assignments. But oddly enough, even though it's one of the longer assignments to read through, it's actually one of the faster ones to do. So don't get disheartened. You should be fine. So don't worry about it. So we're going to be doing one PSD document with 3 groups. It will have comps, roughs, and thumbnails. And these will be groups. In other words, these folder things over in the layers. See where my little mouse is wiggling? You create those by making a new group. That's the little folder icon at the bottom of the layers panel, and that will get you going. So in the thumbnails folder, you'll have 25 thumbnails on as few layers as possible. In the roughs folder, you'll have 4 roughs on as few layers as possible. In the comps folder, you will have 1 layer with 1 comp, which is a detailed version of your favorite rough. Okay, so what are all those? What are comps, roughs, and thumbnails? We'll get to that in a minute. I'm just going to talk about this a little bit more, and it should hopefully become clear as I walk through this. Throughout illustration, art, and computer graphics courses, instructors, such as myself, will recommend that students produce thumbnails and comprehensives, known as comps, before delving into larger assignments. This is to help students experiment, research, and plan a piece, as well as find potential compositional pitfalls before spending hours at work only to realize that there was a better way of doing things from the start. There's a saying, only after having built your house do you know what you should have known before you started building. And that's the sad truth for many, many large projects. Once you get to the end of the road, you realize that there was a better path to take. Now, that's part of why doing all this pre-planning is so useful. Once you've pre-planned, it's like walking through what you're doing. So there's also another saying, plans are useless, planning is invaluable. We're going to plan all this, and if at the end, when you've turned in this assignment, you've thought about it, and you're like, I don't want to do this for my final, you don't have to do it for your final. Don't worry. These can be 2 separate projects, or this and your final, which we'll have in a couple of weeks, can build off of each other. So you could do this one and then work off of this to do your final, or you could do this one, go, nope, and chuck it away and then start your final and not even worry about it. So don't get stressed out. This is just to start practicing. If you stumble across something that you do want to use for your final, more power to you. If you don't worry about it. You just need to assemble this structured file, and I'll walk you through how to do all of that and turn this in, and you'll be good to go. So let's keep going. When a student makes the leap into the professional world, breaking down and recording each step in planning a piece will become an invaluable process when dealing with clients. Showing clients the possible ways that a piece can be built, as well as having them sign off on a design before starting a large, expensive, or time-consuming project protects the artist, that's you, from problems that can come up later. Occasionally, the people overseeing your project will be replaced. If there isn't a record of what has been agreed upon, you can find yourself out of luck and not being paid. If you've had a person with authority sign off on each preliminary step and you've kept records of it, that's important. Just don't assume that because they have a record, it's all hunky-dory. Sometimes you have to keep them yourself. You won't end up in the lurch. I remember a story I heard once of a contractor who was doing some tiling, but the person he was working for was elderly and was in early, was coming down with dementia, sadly enough. But because it was one of his first projects, he didn't have her sign off on things, and she couldn't remember stuff. And so for years, every few weeks, he had to go back and talk about the same thing every time because he was contractually obligated to. And it wasn't until the person's daughter came in and it's like, okay, we're gonna let you off the hook, was he able to leave, because she honestly didn't remember. So always make sure you get everything in writing. It can become very, very, very important. On a less sad note, this can also be lucrative. Some artists can do beautifully detailed comps and will charge after a certain number of them. In this case, I remember 4. In other words, the clients have to have selected a layout from a simple rough, and then the artist will create a more detailed comp and show it to the clients. At that point, the client may request as many changes as they'd like, but after producing, say, 3 more preparatory drawings, these comps, the billable hours begin. Every additional comp would come with a bill that needed to be settled before the next one began. So in this case, the guy who told me this story, there was a case of a committee that would call in this mural artist every week for a new comp, and I believe they were paying $250 per comp drawing, and it continued for months. Eventually, the artist was well paid, and the art selection committee was satisfied, but they were a lot poorer. They ended up needing to raise more funds to actually complete the mural because they'd spent essentially $1,000 a month every month for quite a few months just discussing what should be changed. But this was fine for the artist. He'd sit down, he'd make these things, and then he'd bring them back in, and they'd have more changes. And he had a bigger portfolio. He was paid well enough for it. He had other jobs going on. This wasn't his only thing. So it worked out really well. So comps can be really useful. We still haven't gone over what a comp is, but we'll do that in just a moment. For this assignment, you will be creating thumbnails, roughs, and a single comprehensive of your final project. Again, you don't have to do this for your final if you decide you don't like it, but this is the idea we're working on. A poster for a real event, either an upcoming or past event, is fine. See the attachment for more details. We just went over that one. Scroll down a little more. Over the course of your career, you'll see terms like thumbnails, roughs, comps, comprehensives, design roughs, compositions, preliminaries, sketches, studies, tonal studies, preparatory drawings. There's a whole lot more. They'll be thrown around, but they could have very different meanings behind them. It never hurts to ask what a creative director means by a term, or if you are the creative director or you're the artist working with the client, explain to them what you mean by one. So we're going to do that too. What do I mean by a thumbnail? What do I mean by a rough? What do I mean by a composition? This by no means is a universal, although thumbnails is pretty close. This is what I'm going to be referring to for this assignment. It's the amount of work that you'll need to put out in order to get an A for this particular assignment. And if you go over the top on this, you're probably wasting time. You don't need to spend too much time on the earlier stages. Spend that time on the comp, and we'll talk about that in a minute. What do I mean by a thumbnail? So I'm going to define a thumbnail as this. A thumbnail is where you do your visual thinking. It may be a complete, although teeny tiny little layout with a few ideas jotted down. This is where you think, experiment, and grow. For this assignment, a thumbnail is a very small doodle of a layout. It shouldn't be more than 2 inches in its longest measurement, and it's unlikely that would contain any readable text. You should be able to fit a considerable number of thumbnails on a page, and each should take a minute or 2 to produce. So let me show you some thumbnails. And here we go. Okay, here's a page of thumbnails. So this was for one of the MJC new music concerts. I was doing the poster for it. That was a lot of fun. Let's take a look at this. So these thumbnails, notice the only word I put up was the new music concert, and I included a little MJC swish. I didn't even do that on all of them. I was just going through some different ideas, and these had meaning to me at the time. Like, what if it was a tree? What if it was a bigger tree? Well, if we're doing a tree, what if it had like some kind of arc? I don't know, like a piece of paper. And then I started getting into that idea of paper. I thought, what if it was a giant drum? What if those were lights? I just wrote down little things, and I had different little guys in here. And this was just a little pencil drawing to get going. And these didn't take very long at all. And that's the point of a thumbnail. It's for you to just work things out visually and have something to come back to later. So if you decide, wait, I need to come back to this, what was that one thing I had thought of? You wrote it down, you're good to go. So you'll be set. Those are essentially thumbnails. Close those up, something nice and tiny. So what is a rough? A rough is a developed thumbnail. This is where you start thinking through the design problems and working out the details. In the future, outside of class, you may find yourself moving back and forth between roughs and thumbnails as you think of new ideas or discover previously unknown problems. For this assignment, a rough is a simple drawing, in quotes, because we'll get to it, but you can use pretty much anything you need to use to get this thing done, where any text is either handwritten or there's a placeholder font, or most of the text will be excluded at this point. Just drawing lines where you intend to put things later is perfectly reasonable. A rough is about the size of a half sheet of paper. Roughs will take a little longer to put together. Plan to spend around 15 to 30 minutes on each of them. And now heads up on this, this is where you get a small time pit, if you will, for it. You're doing 4 of these. And so if you're spending 30 minutes on each of these, do put aside 2 hours, because otherwise you're going to be trying to rush through it and it will cause you problems. So keep in mind the time constraints on this. If it's only taking you maybe 30 seconds to 2 minutes per thumbnail, it's fine. If it ends up being 2 minutes per thumbnail, on this assignment, I'm going to ask for 25 of them, as we know from way up at the top here where I said 25 thumbnails. With 25 of these things, it's going to be about 50 minutes, nearly an hour for the thumbnail process. And then on the rough, if you're going about it, it could be around 2 hours for the rough process. So that's 3 hours so far. Keep track of this. You might need to schedule things well. Later on, it's a good habit to be in if you're billing your clients. So let's go back to this guy over here. So I picked a handful of these that I thought were the most interesting to me. And then I started doing roughs on these so that I could get through them. So I had the kind of the one on the bottom right. I'm like, what if this is like a musical scroll and it has little people on it? I had the idea of a tree that was maybe growing musical note fruit. And you can see, again, there's very little text. There's just space where I would put the text. I had the idea of a ship, but I couldn't really find a good place to put text in this. I was thinking maybe in the waves, but at this point, this is when I dropped this idea, simply because it wasn't going to make a very legible poster. I'd have to do something like make the little players on the ship much smaller, and I didn't really want to do that. It became a whole thing, so I decided, no, I'm not going to do that. I had another idea, just kind of put them in like a music hall on stage. I thought that could be fun, but I believe I ended up not doing this one because I think I've done something like this in the past, so I decided to put it on hold. But as you can see from each of these, they're more detailed versions of the thumbnails, essentially. It's me planning this out, thinking through it. And I'm going to show you some of your fellow students and what they did soon, and you'll get an idea of how they thought through all this stuff. So I started leaning more towards this one just due to the difficulties of where to place text. This seemed like it would still be interesting visually everywhere, while at the same time I'd have plenty of room wherever I needed it to put things down. So those ended up being my roughs. So what is a comp? A comp is a refined rough the size of a sheet of paper. This is where you work out the rough selected by the client. So, you'd show these normally to a client. In this case, I was given leeway just to do the whole design and run it by. If you're doing these for clients, though, absolutely include them in this process and say, hey, here are some ideas I'm thinking of. This is the direction I'm planning on going with this. Do any of these strike you as something you'd want to have done? And have this conversation. Sit down with them. Do some more thumbnails with them. Start working out some more roughs, because then they can start getting some ideas. And there are going to be a lot of back and forth emails, so you might want to keep these small in file size so that they can receive them easily. So you've got those guys. But then when you get to the comp, once they've selected a rough, you start drawing things in. For this assignment, you will choose the rough. At this point, you would draw or collage in major design elements that will appear in the final piece. You leave space for text that may be added later, or put in filler text, so you can choose fonts and that sort of stuff. You'll want to explore fonts that will be used at this point, although for this particular assignment, not necessarily, and we'll get to that in a minute. A comp is to be used as a blueprint for the final work. This is the last chance for a client to make any changes without being charged for a new piece. At this point, the client would sign off on it before you begin work. You may end up doing a few comps before the client is satisfied. So, work into your contract like how many times they get to change this. You may want to include in your contract the number of free comps you will provide before charging for them, and also the price you'll charge for each of them. That way, if they start getting really nitpicky and you've been on the line for like 2 weeks, you're getting paid for your time. So that's very important. For this assignment, the comp will be a polished version of your favorite rough that will demonstrate what you intend to do for the final project. Again, if you were to use this for your final project, you don't have to. This won't actually be your final project. Your instructor, moi, will give you advice in class next week that you may want to incorporate in your final design. Well, will it be in class next week? It may actually, I'm still figuring out the timing for this to get everything in, because you turn it in, then there's another assignment. I believe will actually be the week after to get everything going, or at least when this is all done. We'll sort it out as we go. You may also decide to do a different event or design entirely. All right, so that's what the thumbnails are and the roughs are. Let me show you some comps. So here is, based off of the rough, here's the comp. And so at this point, I had some filler to put in. I had some rough doodles, that sort of thing. This gives an idea of what it looks like. This you can show your client. You can get them to sign off. You may want to bring in a red pen and go, this will be changed, this will be changed, this will be changed. That may be sufficient for them to sign off on it. Once you've gone in and red penned everything, you've said these will be these colors to be discussed later, whatever, you're ready to go at that point. Do write everything down, get paid, get everything signed off. That's all important. So here we have it though. So I'm going to give you a peek of what this ended up looking like. This was the black and white version of the poster. It ended up being pretty close to the rough. I left the space for the text, but I moved some things around in this case. Here was the logo. I'm seeing now a lot of stuff I would have changed, but that time has come and gone. I had some more information on it. I was not happy with how this got squashed. This was kind of a last minute change that had to be done. Such is life on that. But yeah, the client seemed happy. At the time I was happy with it. There was a version that was in color, and these were the colors that were used. And yeah, that is the whole process from thumbnail to a finished product here. These were printed out and posted around, used to advertise. There you have it. Notice that from the comp, you're not locked in. Or from the rough, you're not locked in. You keep refining until you get to the final piece. All right, so that's the first page of the assignment. We'll talk about page 2 in the next video, so you can skip straight to it if you need to without having to go over the whole thing again. Okay, see you next video.